Welcome to this week's Wednesday Wisdom. And at long last, I'm going to waffle on and pass on some of my limited knowledge and amateur knowledge about that wonderful golden amber Scotch whisky. So, what is Scotch whisky? Well, there are two types, mainly, malt and grain. It's made in Scotland to be Scotch, and it must be made in a manner made to the specified current regulations. That took a bit of a waffle. Right. Malt whisky came first, believe it or not. Malt whisky came well before the grain whiskies. Malt whisky is malted barley. Grain whiskies are made from wheat or rye or cheap barley, but they are not malted. They are just made from the simple grain. So what is malting? Well, malt whisky takes barley. It takes barley and it malts it. And what that means is it allows it to germinate and start to grow, and then the process is stopped at that point where it starts to grow from the seed into the plant. And that means that they have the maximum natural sugar available to them, because when they make the whisky, nothing is added to a good malt whisky. All you have is water, malted barley and yeast. Some of the modern and not so good malt whisky, shall we say, add a little caramel at some stage to give colour, but that is normally the domain of the grain whisky. Now, grain whisky, same process to make it, but no malting takes place, just the sugars as they were in the seed. So, many are going to think that the grain whiskies came first. In fact, they didn't. Malt whisky was the first whisky, and the grain whiskies appeared, the rye and the wheat, because they are cheaper to make. Now, in the scheme of things, for you and I, when the bottle arrives in our hands and we hand over the hard-earned for it, it would make very little difference, to be honest, because the tax makes up most of the cost of the whisky. But if you took the cost of the whisky, took the cost of the tax off, then you would see a big difference between those prices, because the malting process takes time, fuel, and obviously therefore costs more. All Scotch whisky must be aged in oak barrels for at least 3 years, and the age specified on a bottle of malt is the youngest whisky in that bottle. Now, why would there be more than one? Well, we'll come to that. We'll talk about blends. Now, with a malt whisky, it's normally longer. You normally see 8 years as the youngest malt whisky, variations on 10, 12, 18, 24, etc. beyond that. But the youngest for it to be called a whisky is 3 years. Before 2009, when a whole new raft of legislations came in, blended whisky could contain a mix of grain and malt whiskies. After that, this changed a little. Now, normally these days, a single malt indicates that all the spirits in the bottle come from one distillery. Not from one distillation, but from one distillery. Hence the 3 years and all the rest of it. Now, obviously, there is a proliferation at the moment of no age specified malt whiskies. This isn't actually to hide the age. This is to give them shiny new names to compete with gin, which is cheap and cheerful to produce compared with whisky. Anyway, back to what I was saying. A single malt, the whisky has to be malt, and it has to come from the same distillery. There are blended malts. I'm trying not to name names because so far no whisky distillery has come forward to sponsor me. But if it's from more than one distillery, there is a quite famous one which came from 3 distilleries, it then becomes a blended malt. Grain whiskies, which are nearly always blended, will never use the word malt, even though they can contain a malt whisky. There is a very famous moody whisky, shall we say, which one of the whiskies in that grain whisky is actually a malt, and the standalone malt is superb. So we've got this product, it's malt whisky, although it's not yet. What happens is the mixture of water, the malted barley and the yeast is allowed to ferment. Once you've fermented it and you've got the wash, that is moved into the stills where it is distilled to produce the spirit we know. The spirit is then put through the stills up to 3 times, because the first part of the run doesn't get used but gets fed back into the next run. The main body of the run is collected and the third part of the run goes back into the next run. And this main part may be distilled again, etc, etc, but at the end of that process, once it comes out of the still, it is placed into the oak barrels. Now the oak barrels used to come mainly from Spain and the sherry barrels, but that source is drying up. More and more sherry is not being made in barrels, but luckily the Americans produce loads and loads of bourbon in barrels, and they can only use their barrels the one time, so those barrels provide a great source of barrels for making whisky. The whisky goes into the barrel and is left to mature. The time it takes and the various different barrels that it takes to make up a bottling are known to the distillman. There is a guy at each distillery responsible for the taste of each particular blend and whisky, and they're relying on his palate, his feel, his touch, and his ability to produce a consistent product. What a great talent and what a great job that must be. Returning. So where did Scotch whisky come from? Well, the first official mention in the Scottish Exchequer records is around 1495. Yes, the government wanted its cut, and there's all sorts of history involved with beating the Exchequer, smuggling and illicit stills. Whisky itself came from Scotland and other countries. They've been making the water of life for centuries before this, though. And what use was it? Not for drinking. No, it was a medicinal product. Told you. No, and it was used for both drinking and as an antiseptic. But then, of course, as I say, 1495, the government wanted its cut. Found something else it could tax. As I said previously, there are only two main types of Scottish whisky, malt and grain. However, each, and in particular malt, divide into subgroups. They split mainly by region, but there are exceptions, as we'll see. Flavour, aroma and finish differ widely from one single malt and from the next, and from one region to the next. But single malt whiskies, they're categorised in the following way. Whisky producing regions mainly. You've got the Highland, the Island, which is a subsection, if you like, of the Highland, the Speyside, the Islay malts, Lowland malts, and Campbelltown malts. Campbelltown malts are now largely defunct. There used to be 30 plus distilleries around Campbelltown. There is only one or two of those left, but they do produce a very nice whisky. I'm not going to give samples, however, you could all probably come up with samples from each of the regions. I don't like any one more than the others. I like my Islay malts, but I like my Island malts. I like my Speysides. There's one exception to that. Those who know me will know I often denigrate that whisky. But again, I'm not sponsored by anyone in particular, so I will keep sampling the whiskies I like. There are also malt whiskies which do not fit into any of these broad categories, but they are known by the specific place where they come from. And I'm going to give some examples here, though not naming names. For example, you'll have heard of Orkney malts. They come from Orkney. They're an island malt and they have their own characteristics. There is also the Arran malts. Now, there are only two distilleries on Arran. The one we visited when we were on Arran, and one that is just coming online and into production. Both owned by the same company, but two entirely different whiskies. The Arran malt is the original Arran malt is not a peaty malt like the other malts, the Islay malts, but the new malt coming out of Arran is. So, just to go back to the process, the peat, which I mentioned there, and I perhaps should have mentioned earlier, comes from the way that flavour, that smokiness, comes from the way the barley is malted. It doesn't come in from the water, it doesn't come in from the barrels. It comes entirely from the smoking and drying of the malted barley, because it has to be heated to malt. It's kept in a damp, warm atmosphere, and it absorbs at that point the flavours. But the flavours come from many places, and I'll discuss more about the flavours in the next video, the tasting. But it's not just the smoke from the peat that's used in the maltings, because obviously some don't use smoked peat. It's not just the quality of the water, etc. It is the shape of the still itself. Now, I couldn't find any chemical basis to that. Sorry, I shouldn't have said that. That's coming in a second. I shouldn't. I sort of hummed and hawed about that and thought, well, why is a different shape different? And I had it explained to me recently, and it's the shape affects the surface area. It affects the amount of copper that is in touch with the spirit as it goes through its gaseous form and distills out. And it can mean that different chemicals are added and taken away at that point by the copper. It then runs off into the barrel, and the barrel, the oak and the bourbon, etc. that are soaked into the barrel, add flavours at that point. But we'll talk more about tasting in the second video. Now you know a little bit about whisky and the whisky process. If you want to find out more, there is plenty out there on the web, but I can recommend a trip to a Scottish distillery, take a trip round, learn about the whisky, have a taste and see what you like. I had a jibe at gin earlier on, but many distilleries these days are producing gin. And how do they do it? Well, white spirit that comes out of the still can be used for anything. Some of that spirit from some of the distilleries goes to make gin, and it travels down from this area, from other areas, to the various bottling plants, etc., where it is flavoured and bottled and sent away to gin drinkers. Currently, gin has a big revival going on, basically because they're adding different flavours to it. It's cheap to produce, but that doesn't always reflect in the price. We're back to the exchequer and their cut, I suppose, with that. But whisky takes on that separate process. It goes into the barrels and produces the nectar that I love. As I say, I'm no expert, but I hope you'll join me next time when I talk about tasting the whisky, the different flavours, etc., etc. Goodbye for now. Thank you for watching Desmond Stoners. We'll hope you'll join us again for more photos, waffle and video as we travel around Scotland. Bye for now.